Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who attend this lecture from all over the world. Although we may be still stuck in our own countries due to the pandemic, internet allows us to have an easy access to online lectures and talks given by globally renowned scholars. And so today we are really pleased to have Professor Sharon O'Brien here to give us a lecture from Ireland. Sharon is from the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies at Dublin City University. And she's a really prestigious researcher who has published many papers and monographs under the themes of like translation technologies, localization, and crisis communication. Today, she's going to share with us her thoughts and findings in the role of translation in crisis and disasters. Sharon was a coordinator of the EU-funded International Network in Crisis Translation between 2017 and 2020. And she also published several journal articles on the basis of the 2011 tsunami that took place in Japan, and also of how different countries prepare for crisis communication. For disaster and pandemic, this is an issue that we are all facing nowadays. So I believe that we will be able to relate ourselves to what Sharon is going to discuss. And I'm also looking forward to the lecture. So Sharon, I will give the floor to you now.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, so hopefully everybody can now see my slides and hear me okay. Yeah, super. So yes, again, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's very nice to be able to come together, as you say, in a kind of global community to have these online talks. And I'm really, really delighted to have been invited to give you a talk about my work and that of my colleagues around the whole area of crisis translation. So I'm just going to rearrange here a little bit so I can see everything. Okay. So what I hope to cover today, as you can see here in my overview, is to give you a little bit of context around the fields that feed into the work on crisis translation, which is disaster studies, crisis communication, and the phenomenon of globalization. The Interact project was already mentioned as in a starting point or a sort of consolidation of the work that we've done on crisis translation. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the Interact project and the evolving concept of crisis translation. We see more and more research growing in this area, so I'm going to focus in on a few points of research, but I won't be able to cover obviously everything that's being done so far. And then I want to look to the future research agenda to see what way we should be going into the future. I have a number of references and links built into my slides, so don't worry, I will send these to the organizers today, and they will hopefully be able to post these online along with the video. Okay. So one of the things that we first have to ask ourselves is what we mean by a crisis when we talk about the role of translation and interpreting in a crisis. And here I just want to draw your attention to a volume that was published in 1998, which is What is a Disaster? A Dozen Perspectives on the Question. And what this tells us is that even in the field of disaster studies, there isn't one agreed notion of what a disaster is. So scholars are still debating how do we classify these things. In the English language, we talk about crisis, about emergency, about disaster, and sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. But often then they are also differentiated from the perspective of the duration of the event, the cause of the event, and the scale of the event. So in general, you'll hear me talking a little bit about crisis and disaster, maybe interchangeably. It's important to note that these things are not very well defined. I'll explain to you why I use the term crisis quite regularly. You'll see that shortly. But suffice to say that it is an event that is usually sudden, that has unintended impacts on the day-to-day life of a person or a group of people or even a country or a whole region. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the area of disaster studies, which I and my colleagues have drawn on extensively to inform our work on crisis translation. So it's interesting to note that the birth of the academic study of disasters is often attributed to this PhD dissertation from 1920 by Samuel Henry Prince at the University of Columbia. Which was called Catastrophe and Social Change, and it is classified as the first systematic study of a disaster. What he studied was the 1917 collision of two ships in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the impact of that collision. You can see a picture here of the devastation that was caused. So 1,963 people were killed and 9,000 were injured. So you can see that it was a really large-scale disaster. And you might wonder, how could a collision of two ships cause such devastation on land? The reason was that one of these ships was carrying ammunition to New York. And of course, when the two ships collided, this was similar to a bomb explosion. However, Alexander in 2017 tells us that perhaps the study of disasters from a systematic and social perspective started even earlier. And I'm sure there are other examples that people could come up with. He talks about the documentation by Simmons in 1888 of the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. So we can see that the study of disasters and the impact on society dates back for a very, very long time. In the 1940s and 1950s, then we saw a consolidation of the field of disaster studies, especially driven out of the US and probably because of the Cold War, where the focus was on the social psychological aspects of disaster. In other words, the behavior of people should a very serious event occur. And this research really influenced the international field. Now, in addition to disaster studies, we also have the field of crisis communication, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. According to Heath and O'Hare, this was established more recently in around the 1980s. We're familiar with crisis communication probably from a business perspective, where perhaps a company has created a product that has some faults and perhaps causes some harm to somebody. And so those products have to be recalled from the market. The crisis communication aspect there is very much around reputation management. But we're familiar with other kinds of crisis communication, which is what we are more interested in, which is communicating during a disaster or a health crisis, such as the pandemic that we've all experienced in the last few years. Now, if we look at these two fields and then consider the extent of globalization that has occurred in the last number of decades, which has led to increasing multilingualism in cities and regions that weren't very multilingual prior to that, we see that we have an increasing need in these areas for translation. And then if a crisis occurs, then we especially have a need for translation during a cascading crisis, which is a crisis where an event occurs which leads to another disastrous event and perhaps even another disastrous event. So taking disaster studies, globalization, but also the field of crisis communication together, my colleagues and I have worked in this area, came up with the term crisis translation to study and talk about the role of translation and interpreting in crisis settings. So the EU-funded Interact project was mentioned already. This was a project that went from 2017 to 2020, which involved a lot of stakeholders from different disciplines, from the commercial world and from the not-for-profit world. This was really a networking project where the aim was to bring all of these stakeholders together to do some research on the role of translation and interpreting in crisis settings. I won't talk much about this project except to say that it has really led to a lot of the work that we have published. You'll see a link there to the project website, which is still live, and that has the description of the project and all of the outputs that we created during this time. The project the funding is finished, but we have continued to work on aspects of crisis translation since then, building new research ideas and getting some additional funding for different projects. And we try to keep this website up to date with all of the things that we are doing. So if you're interested in learning more about that project, please do visit that website. At the very start of that project, we needed to have a working definition of crisis translation to keep us focused on what we were doing. And so in one of our publications in 2019, we talked about crisis translation as any form of linguistic and cultural transmission of messages that enable access to information during an emergency, regardless of the medium. But we knew this was a working definition, and it really is an evolving concept. So in 2020, for example, in one of the publications, we add to this that crisis translation considers language barriers in the context of multi-dimensional cascading effects that widen existing vulnerabilities or engender new ones by means of miscommunication. So you'll see that our thinking on what is crisis translation is constantly evolving. But the fundamental premise remains the same, which is that in our age of globalization, with increased urbanization and increased migration, communication before, during, and after a crisis must be multilingual and multicultural. And this communication is enabled through translation and/or interpreting. And you'll see I've emphasized here before, during, and after a crisis, which is something I want to talk about in a little bit more detail later. I would note that we commenced work on the topic of crisis translation before the COVID-19 pandemic. But actually the pandemic has reinforced the need for translation and attention to translation during a crisis, which I'm sure all of you have observed. And it has also underlined the role of translation in risk reduction during these kind of events. The United Nations statement here is a nice one that speaks to risk reduction. No one is safe until everyone is safe, which is a refrain that we all heard during the pandemic. And of course, if nobody is safe until everybody is safe, that means everybody has to have relevant communication in a very timely manner. Now, one of the questions that we get asked a lot when we talk about crisis translation is, where does it sit in translation studies? And does it include interpreting? So the answer to that is yes, absolutely, it includes interpreting. When we think about a crisis, we often think about an event and the immediate hours or days after that event. And then our minds turn to the role of interpreting, which is really, really important at that particular time. But when we were looking at how translation was talked about in crisis settings, which to be honest wasn't very much, the role of written translation was often not considered. So for that reason, during the Interact project, we have focused a lot on the role of written translation in crisis settings, because we saw it as an area that needed further attention. And so this wasn't meant to exclude interpreting in any way, but rather just to refocus the conversation onto the written aspect and how that could contribute. We've also been asked, and on various occasions, where does crisis translation sit in relation to other areas in translation studies that deal with similar kind of concepts like conflict, like humanitarian aid, or the development nexus, and community translation. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I think, of course, there are significant overlaps in terms of what we look at and what scholars who might be looking at conflict or development or community translation might be looking at. But there are some differences as well, I think, overlaps and definitely differences. So in relation to conflict, I would say that not all crises are as a result of a conflict. When we look at humanitarian aid and the development nexus, perhaps the level of urgency, risk, and danger are different. I'm not saying that there's no risk or danger in humanitarian situations or in development situations, but perhaps it's more exacerbated in a sudden crisis. Certainly in community translation, this is a very broad concept, so we might have some vulnerable people who are availing of community translation, but also community translation involves web translation, fan subbing, and so on. So the underlying vulnerabilities of those who maybe need translation are perhaps different in these two areas. And then the nature of the content to be translated might, of course, be different across all of these different areas. But to be honest, I think that for me, it's not really that important to try and position this in an area within translation studies. What is more important is to note that the overarching goals are very similar, which is to ensure that anyone who needs relevant and accurate information in a timely manner to assist with action that could secure their well-being, their health, their safety, and even their lives, that they have access to that information in a language that they can understand and act on, and also in an appropriate format, whether that's text, audio, or image. So I think that all of these areas share a very similar goal in that respect. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit today about the notion of crisis response and prevention and management. So you see here a picture from a website where they're talking about natural hazards and explaining what natural hazards are. And they use the phrase, the disaster cycle. The disaster cycle is something that you see very regularly in discussions in disaster studies. So it's typically shown in this kind of a diagram. You see that there are 4 stages. There's an event with the response stage, then you have recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. So where does translation fit in this disaster cycle? Well, as I've already mentioned, when we think about translation, we usually think about the response stage. Something bad has happened, people need communication. Some of those people don't speak the language in which most of the communication is happening. Therefore, translation and interpreting is required. So that's how we think initially about translation in this cycle. But we would argue that actually translation has a role to play in all of these areas and phases in a disaster cycle. And that's what's been largely ignored, I think, to date. So translation can play a role in the recovery stage, in the mitigation and preparedness stages, which are trying to make sure that people are that the risks are reduced and that people are prepared in case another crisis occurs. But it's also important to note, actually, that within disaster studies itself, there is considerable debate about this conceptualization of disaster as a cycle. And I refer here to an interesting paper written by Bosher et al. With the nice title, "Stop Going Around in Circles Towards a Reconceptualization of Disaster Risk Management Phases." And what these scholars argue is that looking at disasters from a cycle perspective, in a way, continues to promote the inevitability of a disaster, of no learning effects. And so they propose instead perhaps conceptualizing crisis in the form of a helix, which you can see here, hopefully in the slide, where you have reducing angles in the helix as time goes on. And those reducing angles illustrate reduction in risk and negative impacts over time due to risk reduction interventions. Now, they don't talk about translation, but we would add in here that translation is a risk reduction intervention. If you give people the right information in the language that they can understand, then they are more ready or prepared for a crisis, and we don't have to continue this disaster cycle of not really learning as we go. Hopefully, for example, we have learned a lot from the pandemic in the last 2 years, and we wouldn't like to see all of what we've endured repeated again in another decade, for example. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of research being done on crisis translation over the past decade or so. And I'd like to focus in on just 3 areas, just to give you a taste of what has been done so far. So today I'll focus on emergency management policies, on citizen translators and training, and technology and crisis translation. So with regards to emergency policies, we've done some research on this during the Interact project, and we started out with the question, what do emergency response policies say about translation? Do they mention it? And if so, what do they say about it? We've published a paper on this in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. So again, if you're interested, can you hear me okay now? Yeah, I think I got muted there. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more about this, please, read the paper, because there's a lot more detail today. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview here. One of the issues that we faced when we were asking this question is what qualifies as an emergency response policy. And we discovered that they're difficult to define, because they might be formal policies or they might actually be informal. Sometimes they're presented as frameworks or guidelines. They might be documented or they might not be documented, and they can exist at lots of different levels, so local, regional, national, and even international levels. So finding and identifying emergency response policies in the first instance is a tricky endeavor. However, we found emergency response policies for 5 countries that we were interested in, which you see listed here. We chose these 5 countries for a variety of reasons. One was that it represented the makeup of our team that was working on the research, but also the countries differ significantly in terms of the hazards that they're exposed to, in terms of their experience of emergency response, and in terms of their multilingualism. So we thought that they would be very useful to do a sort of comparison between the emergency response policies of these 5 countries. We used a framework called the 4A standards to analyze the emergency response policies for those 5 countries. This is a framework that was actually developed to analyze the right to education, not obviously the right to translation. And so we had to customize it ourselves to look at the right to translation during a crisis response. The 4 A's stand for availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. So again, you'll see how we reoriented this in the paper to look at availability of translation, accessibility of translation, and so on. So our starting point was that we didn't think that translation would really be given significant thought in these emergency response policies, and it's no surprise that that was the case. The assessment sheds light on how the right to translated information is generally not really considered in these 5 national approaches to disaster management. But that's not to say that it wasn't considered at all. It was mentioned as something that emergency responders should think about in all of the response policies, but only in a superficial way in the response policy for Ireland, the UK, and New Zealand. It was considerably better in Japan's policy. And the best scenario, or the best case that we saw, was the USA's emergency response policy, which of course is driven very much by the Hispanic community there and the very strong bilingualism in the States between Spanish and English. We also looked at some international policies and in particular international humanitarian response organizations and what their policies tell us about how they consider translation in their activities. Again, there's a report on this, which is available to you on the Interact website. So here we didn't use the same type of analysis, but we interviewed people who are stakeholders in these international organizations about how they implement policy on translation in their activities. And again, just to summarize our findings here from these interviews, all of the interviewees were unanimous in acknowledging that providing different language access is fundamentally important to their humanitarian operations. But they also stated that at the time of those interviews, their capacity to formalize or routinize those efforts was quite limited. This usually comes down to a lack of budget for translation, lack of resources, other priorities, of course, and maybe also a lack of training for those who are involved in the organization on how to do translation or how to manage translation. Okay, so all of this work led to 10 very high-level recommendations on policy for crisis translation. Again, you can access this, so I'll provide all of these links after my talk. So you can see those 10 high-level recommendations for policy implementers to perhaps better introduce the need for and the right to translation in emergency response policies. An interesting thing that we learned during this work is that policy does not guarantee implementation. In other words, if the policy talks about the need for and the provision of translation in emergency response, that doesn't guarantee that it will actually happen. That always depends on the resources and the will to implement. But we also learned an interesting lesson, which was that implementation does not necessarily require formal policy. In other words, you can see translation happening even if it's not formally written out in a national policy, for example. And a good example of this was some follow-on work that we did during the initial stages of the pandemic in Ireland. We have a report on this which was published in January 2021, where my colleague Pat Cadwell and I looked at how the health executive in Ireland was managing and approaching translation of COVID-19 information in the first 6 months of the lockdown and the pandemic. We looked at our emergency response policy again, and since the time that we had analysed the policy, I think there were about 2 to 3 years had elapsed. No revisions had happened to that policy. However, we could see that the authorities in my country were providing translation in 24 languages during the initial stages of COVID-19. So this showed that translation had become part of the crisis response policy without actually being implemented or written into that policy. This was a really good effort, but we looked at how this was implemented using a maturity model for crisis response. And our conclusion was that we were not yet very mature in terms of how we were implementing crisis translation. And we still have a long way to go to make this something that is very well embedded in our national responses. So again, we have a paper on this coming out, hopefully in the next few months. So moving on from policy to who does the translating in a crisis. So obviously professional translators and interpreters are really important in crisis translation. But we do need to recognize that they are sometimes in short supply during a crisis or in crisis settings in general. The reasons for that is that maybe they don't even exist as professionals in some of the languages that are typically involved in a crisis because there's no training or no, professional programs. There may, even if there are professional translators, there may not be a sufficient number of them to cope with the translation demands during a crisis. And crucially, translators and the large body of translators can themselves be impacted by a crisis, which means that they are not able to work professionally during the response stage of a crisis. So this leads to a situation where crisis response sometimes requires volunteers. And there's a very strong tradition of volunteering by professionals and amateurs in crisis response in many different areas like engineering, in medicine, and so on. To quote the New Zealand Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management document on volunteerism in crisis response, it's viewed as a legitimate way in which people can participate in the activities in their community. And they also say that it's an activity that deserves recognition and respect. I think that that's really quite an important statement. So if we talk about translation volunteers in a crisis response, of course, we hear the response ourselves that the stakes are very high if the translation is wrong. And this is absolutely true. But the stakes are also very high if there is no translation, if there's no information available. So within our Interact project team, our stance on this was not to condemn linguistic volunteers who weren't qualified as professional translators or interpreters, but to help towards educating them. And so with this in mind, we created some what we call 101 course content on translation for use by volunteers in crisis translation settings. What you can see here in the slide is the thumbnails from our YouTube channel with these very short 101 snippets of training on what is translation, how does translation work, what's the typical process, why is the source text and the quality of the source text important, what is terminology, also including what is machine translation, what is post-editing, and what are the things that need to be taken care of if you're using machine translation and post-editing. So these are all available to anybody to have a look at on this Crisis Translation YouTube channel. In addition to that, in terms of education, we also spent some considerable time between 3 of the academic partners to create a master's module on crisis translation. So this would be a class or a course that students of translation at master's level can take. This master's module has now been running for several years at Dublin City University, University College London, and the University of Auckland. It's typically attended by our translation studies students. In the case of DCU, we also open this up to some students who are studying refugee integration. So we have a very nice mix of students in the classroom, some studying refugee integration, some translation and translation technology, which makes for a really nice dynamic in the classroom. And the objective here is to give training to these students so that when they go out, if they end up working in humanitarian aid or emergency response, they know a lot about the role and the need for translation and interpreting in crisis settings, and they can advocate and lobby for that. Okay, so the last focal point in terms of research that I wanted to talk about was translation technology and crisis response. There are kind of opposing views, if you like, on the role of translation technology in a crisis scenario. On the one hand, some people might say there isn't really a role for traditional CAT tools in this area, and certainly that machine translation is far too risky to use. And then on the other end of this scale, you have frequently you hear comments like, why not just use machine translation? Which usually comes from people who don't know much about translation. And also, why not just use pictures? Now, I have this in brackets today because I'm not going to talk about that in detail, but it is an interesting one that often gets suggested to us. Well, there are examples of machine translation being used in crisis response. You might be familiar with one of those in particular, which was the rapid development of an English to Haitian Creole machine translation system following the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which is documented by Lewis and Monroe and Fogel. Of course, there are very many issues in relation to the use of machine translation in crisis response, not least the accuracy of the system, the fact that neural machine translation can produce highly fluent sounding output, which could be misleading, the lack of digital language resources for training machine translation systems for languages that might be impacted by crisis, and obviously the reliance on available infrastructure and broadband during a crisis, because that infrastructure and the broadband may, for example, not be available for whatever reasons during a crisis impact. So lots of reasons why machine translation is problematic, but I don't think that we should dismiss it as a crisis response technology. And I would like to note as well that translation memory tools do have a role to play, but especially I think in the other stages of a crisis, like in preparedness, in mitigation, in recovery. Because the content that needs to be translated for those stages is probably like longer text that might have some repetition. And there is a less urgent time scale when you compare that to the time scale involved in the response stage to a crisis. And the third technology to consider here, among other technologies, of course, is terminology management and the tools that support terminology management. And again, they have a very important role to play here. We do note that in disaster humanitarian settings, there are efforts to create multilingual glossaries for the languages that might be involved. But typically this involves creating PDFs that just get uploaded to a website and not much more besides. So while they are useful, their use is fairly limited. And instead, what we do need is culturally specific multilingual term bases that might be enabled on offline mobile apps during crisis response. These could be very, very useful, I think. So let me give you one example. This is a follow-on project from the Interact project that was led by Professor Federico Federici from University College London. I wasn't involved in this project. Federico did all of the work here, where he collaborated with expert linguists and disaster responders and community stakeholders in Sierra Leone in order to translate the United Nations disaster risk reduction terminology into 5 of the languages that are spoken in Sierra Leone. And in addition to creating the terminology, they also developed pictograms or pictures that were culturally appropriate to accompany the terminology. And the pictograms were there in order to help tackle low literacy among those included in the 5 languages. So here's a link to a YouTube video of Professor Federici explaining the project, which if you're interested, of course, you can go and listen to his explanation and overview of the project. And here's one of his collaborators, Pius Mana, talking also on a separate YouTube video about the languages that they included in this initiative. Here he's showing the book that they've published out of the initiative, obviously with a great deal of pride. And then he goes on to talk about the next stage of this project, where they will develop a mobile app where all of that terminology will be available offline on the mobile app. So that's a very nice example of technology coming into play for terminology management in crisis response. So where do we go next in our research and our efforts on crisis translation? To finish up, I want to talk a little bit about maybe what directions we should go in here. And I'll draw on a document that was published by FEMA, the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, in 2018, so not so long ago, which is a proposed research agenda for emergency management higher education community. This document, as it says, is for emergency management research, not translation research. In fact, translation doesn't get a look in this document at all. But they felt it was necessary, I think, to provide this guidance to the disaster studies community, because it is a very interdisciplinary community, as you can well imagine. And they were concerned, I think, about, but due to the interdisciplinarity of a lot of duplication of effort rather than working together and replication of research findings. And in this document, they talk about the 5 guiding principles that they would like to see guiding the higher education community in terms of their research. So first of all, scanning the horizon. This means looking at what do we already know and what's not known in order to guide our efforts in research. Secondly, fostering interdisciplinarity. Which is seen as much more valuable than having siloed discussions in our own little domains or subdomains in our disciplines. Thirdly, embracing ethics, which of course is a necessity, especially if you're doing research on crises, emergencies, disasters, and their impact on people. Fourthly, transferring knowledge and ensuring that knowledge is transferred not just within academia through our academic publications, but to all relevant stakeholders. And that ties in very neatly with the last point, which is maximizing the impact of the research, which I think is actually the biggest challenge that we all face. We can do very good research, but maybe the impact is not what it should be. So in addition to these 5 guiding principles, they also present 5 research thrusts. And again, just to say, this is for research in disaster studies, but I want to talk about how I see translation playing a role in each one of these. So the first research thrust is a focus on justice, equity, and capacity development. And obviously, translation can play a role and does play a role already in how translation can contribute to increased justice, increased equity, and capacity development for crisis response. So it's very easy for us to see ourselves as a discipline contributing to that. Secondly, risk buildup and disaster exposure, which I would combine here with the high-risk habitation zones. As I mentioned, we shouldn't be just looking at translation as a response tool in a crisis, but as a tool for risk reduction. So what can we translate into what languages, for whom, and how, in order to reduce the risks that people are exposed to? And cast your mind back to that helix. So we're trying to reduce the impacts over time through translation of content. The next research thrust is data, technology, and societal impacts. And of course, here in translation studies, we talk a lot about data, about translation technology and its societal impact. And so I think that we can take that thrust and look at machine translation specifically, but other kinds of technologies and how they can have a positive societal impact in disaster studies. And the last point here is the infrastructure for humanity. And in the FEMA report, what they mean by this is, well, not just, but focusing a little bit on accessibility. So here we might be thinking about accessibility of content, of web content. We might be thinking about speech to text, speech to speech, providing content for deaf and hard of hearing and blind communities, providing content for elderly communities, for those with low literacy skills, and so on. So as you can see, I think it's very easy for translation studies to be guided by these research thrusts coming from the field of disaster studies. There are many, many topics that are also being researched today and previously in this area that I haven't talked about at all, but I just wanted to mention these very briefly, like accessibility, sign language interpreting, plain language or simplification, the role of multimodality, the role of social media, and the important role of ethics in all of this. So a lot more work is going on in these areas. So to conclude, this is my last slide. I wanted to ask the question of myself, but also of all of you. What would real progress look like in the field of crisis translation if we were to continue doing research on this? What would progress look like? So I think that progress would be made if translation is not simply an afterthought in the disaster prevention management field. That would mean we've made real progress. if budgets are actually allocated for translation and interpreting in disaster response. If the focus changed from being a focus on response to an event to being focused more on the prevention, the risk reduction, and the preparedness aspects of the disaster cycle. If resources for this are created in an interdisciplinary and engaged research paradigm. So by this, I mean with all of the stakeholders who are involved in a crisis rather than just for them. If translation technology is used appropriately and efficiently and ethically in a crisis setting. If appropriate training for translation and interpreting, not just to do translation and interpreting, but how to implement it and use it is offered on a continual basis within the field of disaster response. And finally, I think real progress would be made if suffering due to crisis is reduced and is certainly not made worse by a lack of access to timely, accurate, and culturally appropriate information. So that brings me to the end. These are obviously important and challenging goals for those of us who are interested in working in the area of translation in crisis response. But hopefully they are some goals that we can all work towards. So thank you very much for your attention. And that's the end of my talk.